So I'm sure for many, the title of this video would be a little confusing. You know, you might have some questions like, what is a gob? And that's it. That's the only question. No. But, if someone were to say that, Joe Blues from Arrested Development had anorexia, just pretend that's what the title says, okay? I would be a little skeptical. I mean, like, anorexia? Joe Blues wouldn't have anorexia. He's not that kind of guy. Is exactly what they want you to think. Now, in terms of how mental illnesses manifest, it's a person-to-person kind of situation. People of any race, gender, age, sexuality, etc., 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 can, develop an eating disorder in a myriad of ways. But of course, there are societal expectations that tend to, influence the manifestation, and, also make it harder for some diagnoses to be gotten. In Terrence Real's book about depression and mental illness in men, I Don't Want to Talk About It, he wrote, "A great many men never make it into the official roll call of the depressed because their overt depression remains undiagnosed. But other men fail to get help because their expression of the disease does not fit the classic model as described in the DSM-4. Probably should have chosen a book that was written more recently, but I didn't realize it was written until 1997, till I was writing the script, okay? And the sentiment still holds up. With anorexia, it's typically associated with, thin, upper to middle class, white woman who's never eaten a single thing in her life, not even one time, not even once. And Job decidedly is not a very thin, middle to upper class white woman who has never eaten a single thing, not even once. I don't know if you noticed that. But no, he doesn't fit the stereotypical, presentation, and not just in appearance. He also differs in how anorexia presents itself. Typically, anorexia is thought of as just starving oneself in an effort to get thin enough. But this isn't the only way it can look. Again, not all men experience anorexia in the same way, but a common way it can present itself in men is through the lens of gaining muscle and, getting leaner, having a lot of focus on body fat percentage and stuff. There's still the basic pillars of restriction, a fear of gaining weight, and great concern about how they look. It just shows up in a different kind of way. But because of the stigma around, men getting eating disorders in terms of, they don't get them, or, lack of awareness of all the atypical ways they may show up, men often don't get taken as seriously in terms of the severity or danger of such conditions, especially if they aren't super duper thin. I actually had a hard time myself, identifying what it could be that Job is dealing with, because I just didn't know what I just explained was considered anorexia until I started doing more research. And I'm someone who had anorexia. And, I usually try to, I've done a lot of research into eating disorders, and yet I have never, I've never been told this before. And it feels obvious now, but it was just never explained to me. Lastly, I'm not going to be talking about the way his body looks because, one, you can have anorexia at any shape or size. It doesn't have a look to it. And second of all, I'm not going to attribute a real life person's body to a fictional character's eating disorder. That's just, I'm not going to do that. So, just pretend you don't even know what he looks like. It's like your Marky Bark with a whole person. So this is the timeline. This is how I'm going to be explaining stuff in the first half of this video. And basically just, going through it, and it'll include, real events from the show, along with my theory as to how his eating disorder would have developed. So we start at the episode Colony Collapse, where Job accidentally proposes to Anne. Now I'm sure you're wondering, how do you accidentally propose? Well, he said, "Marry me." Hold on. But he meant it in the show busy way,
Marry me.
Marry me.
Marry me. And may I add, marry me?
Like as a sigh of relief, because she had said that they don't have to be in a relationship together, and he did not want to be in a relationship together because he had gone there to, break up with her. So he was like, oh, thank God. So quite the opposite of what he was thinking. But yeah, she interpreted this literally, and it thrust Job into a marriage he didn't want to be in. And of course, you're probably like, oh, he should have just told her. Well, that's awkward, okay? That's uncomfortable. Would you want to do that? I didn't think so. I did not think so. But yeah, I chose this moment to start at, February 20th, 2006, because it's a very pivotal moment that sets a lot of things into action. While of course there is never a good time for an accidental proposal, this is a particularly inopportune time for Job, because around this time he starts really especially struggling with repressing his sexuality, which if he were to be in this relationship with a woman, he would need to do that. Earlier in the episode, the narrator says, and Job realized that there was finally nothing standing in the way of a loving, committed relationship with Anne, and the look of dread on Job's face as he wilts says it all. On top of that, prior to his accidental proposal, he had sex with Anne, something that he'd been like, yeah, I really want to do that. This is something I want to do so bad. But he, like, after they had sex, he cried and had a breakdown on the floor. So I don't know. I kind of says otherwise.
A body like Arnold with a Denzel face.
Do you like the pun? I'm very proud of it. Now, we don't know exactly when this happened, but sometime after this, he and Anne get an apartment together. And so, you know, Job was not only in a relationship with this woman during a time where he was trying to, you know, struggling to suppress his homosexuality, but also, damn it, but he's also living with her. He can't as easily, you know, evade her. And you know, because obviously it's much better later on, because that would be too awkward to do. But yeah, especially with his family being scattered around everywhere, doing their own thing. He doesn't really have another place to go or like any reason to be anywhere else.
What a man, what a man, what a man, what.
So, what does he do? That's right, he makes an excuse, and an excuse that'll also eventually be the way that he gets out of the wedding. That excuse is his amazing Jesus solution, where naturally on his wedding day, he will act as Jesus, go in a cave for 2 weeks where he's like, you know, sealed in there, and then emerge alive. I don't know why he thinks that's more impressive than coming back from the dead. Also, why are you handcuffing yourself? You're not escaping from there. They're gonna move the stuff. They're gonna get you out. So I don't get what that's supposed to. Anyway, this is the part that gets him, you know, out of the house and away from Anne. Because, you know, in order to be the amazing Jesus, he has to get, you know, work out a lot, to get shredded like Jesus is. And, you know, that gives him the perfect excuse to spend a lot of the time at the gym, or just out of the house and claiming he's at the gym.
Losing, and he knows that my name is not Susan.
Now, even though this is just a part of an escape plan, you know, like, he's still going to be performing the illusion, like the first half of it anyway. You know, like, it may be secretly an escape act, but he's not going to half-ass it, you know? I mean, it's going to be religious-y and epic. He's going to get shredded like Jesus for, like, realism or whatever. This is where he starts to toe a dangerous line. Just as femme people have, you know, expectations of what their body is supposed to look like, so do masked people. The idea that many strive to be muscular has, you know, only become more and more prevalent as time has gone on. In a 2007 study, it was found that more and more over the past 30 years, there were more semi-naked men being shown in magazines. And in another from the same year, after viewing TV with ads with men who have very muscular toned physique, men felt increased depression and increased body dissatisfaction with regard to muscularity. Comparing yourself to idealized, unattainable figures of modern-day superheroes, celebrities, and yes, even shredded Jesus can do harm to one's self-image. Most people who do try to attain the ideal body either don't end up doing that, or they do but can't sustain it, and then they feel like failures. Like they put the blame on themselves for not living up to expectations that they never should have been expected to live up to in the first place. But yeah, to circle back around to Job, obviously nothing about what he's doing yet is necessarily unhealthy. Like, yes, it can lead you down a path, but that's unhealthy, but plenty of people don't go down that path. But obviously he did go down that path because that's what the video is about. So on top of all that, Job really isn't a patient person. And in terms of dieting, we see an example of this in the season 1 episode, Let Him Eat Cake. I need to take this off, my hand hurts. All the blues are on the Atkins diet, and Job, unlike most of the others, clearly like isn't really into it. He doesn't even like understand what exactly like you're supposed to do on it, complaining about how you really can't eat anything on this diet. So I can imagine having these expectations in mind. You know, he might get a little impatient with how long it's taking for, you know, to actually see a difference. And he's incentivized to stick with it because, this isn't just about the illusion, this is what's getting him out of the house. So, he starts eating less and exercising more to try and lose body fat and get leaner. This is the tipping point.
So what? Who cares?
Because by June of that year, his diet's completely fakakta. He says this to Michael in that season 4 episode, Colony Collapse.
Marriage is a lot of pressure, and she's not into it. Meanwhile, I'm working out like crazy. My diet has become insane. And this Jesus character, he was shredded.
So, other than alcohol, his diet seems to be predominantly Dijon mustard and Parmesan cheese based. And on top of that, he's also exercising a ton. Or at least that's what he wants to portray it as, because he very well could be overcompensating for any judgment he might get if his diet wasn't insane enough, or if his exercise routine wasn't crazy enough. In that same scene, he body shames Anne, claiming she's let herself go. She looks the exact same. And also talks about how, after the one time they had sex, she was over it. Refer back to Job crying in a ball on the floor. So it wouldn't surprise me if partially this was an exaggeration in hope of getting, more of a reaction that would reinforce his disordered thinking and confirm that he's doing a good job. Comments about a disordered person's body, what they're eating, especially if it lines up with what they're trying to achieve, often just pushes them farther in the wrong direction. Because also, obviously, I don't think he was literally just eating Parmesan and mustard, because I think he would be dead. He has survived worse, but that was the main tactic he was using to lose weight. It's a crash diet. Hence the thing.
I will never date you because you smell like.
So finally, in April of 2007, we get to what this was all leading up to. The reason why he was working out a ton and why he was restricting a ton. Finally, it's all paid off. Sorta.
Running through, you know who I'm talking about.
He got stuck in the boulder. And that boulder was put in a storage locker. And so, but when he chewed himself out, it didn't even matter because he's locked in a storage locker. And all he had to eat for 2 or 3 weeks was Twizzlers. So the illusion didn't exactly go as planned. But hey, it's over. He can go back to eating normally. He doesn't have to starve himself. He doesn't have to work out a ton all the time. He doesn't. What's that? He doesn't stop. Yeah, I'll tell him. He doesn't stop. Okay. So, like I said, he doesn't stop eating this way. Despite the illusion being long in the past, 6 whole years go by. It's 2012 now. And what do we see on his bed on April 19th, 2012? Yeah, that's right. It's Parmesan and mustard. A blink and you'll miss it, PMS, but it's there. Already the fat phobia ingrained in him would be enough gas to keep his anorexia track going. But for the past 5 of these 6 years, he's been hanging out and desperately working for the acceptance of his new family. A bunch of 20-year-old, sort of famous dudes. He wants to be accepted as one of them. But he is not hip, young, or successful. He's a failed magician approaching 40. And, he sticks out of the bunch, especially looks-wise, which is not, I'm not saying that as a bad thing. That's just how aging works. They're 20, he's 40. That's how that works. Because, obviously. But yeah, he's very likely comparing himself to them, especially since he's already coming into this with body image issues. Plus, he already drinks a ton now. He's drinking even more because he's partying with these guys every night. So that just incentivizes him to continue to restrict even more so he can stay at a deficit in spite of how much he's drinking.
The bottom of a tree.
Hey, remember when I talked about making comments on people's bodies? That's what this one's about. On the night of April 23rd, 2012, Job and Tony have a conversation where Tony compliments Job, telling him that he looked awfully shredded up on that cross. Now, obviously, Tony didn't know Job's situation. Why would he? He didn't mean to have it a bad effect. He was just flirting. But unfortunately, it did, in fact, reinforce Job's whole situation. Now, even worse, Job responds to this by saying, "You should have seen me when they took me out of the storage locker." A storage locker. Storage locker he spent 2 weeks in. Storage locker he spent 2 weeks in starving. The storage locker he spent 2 weeks in starving to the point where he had to go to the hospital. And he just thinks of it like, yeah, it just made me look even better. Need I say more? Actually, I do need to say more. This comment is very significant because we see the direct effect that it has on Job. Damn it. For like 6 years, he's been eating Dijon mustard. Consistently used the same brand of mustard, the same kind of mustard, but all of a sudden his longtime celebrity crush Tony Wonder compliments him for having looked shredded up on that cross, and the literal next day he switches to yellow mustard? Coincidence? I think not. Now, for all you normal people out there, you're probably like, okay, he changes the kind of mustard he uses. Why does that matter? Maybe it was on sale. Well, here's some insider info for you. It's very common among those with restrictive eating disorders to use yellow mustard as a condiment because of its low calories and its strong flavor, specifically yellow mustard. And I'm sorry if I say this wrong, I probably will. Leigh Weingus's article, Everyone's Eating Carrots and Mustard, but is this trendy snack combo feeding into toxic diet culture? They quote TikToker Vanessa Bradford, who explains this exact phenomenon. The whole dipping your carrots in mustard thing is actually a really common eating disorder behavior. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book. Parmesan mustard is clearly something that he feels comfortable eating, but oftentimes in Oftentimes, in restrictive eating disorders, as things continue to worsen, more and more foods become unsafe. Dijon mustard is 15 calories per tablespoon, and yellow mustard is advertised as having 0 calories per tablespoon. The difference is negligent, but to him, it's anything but. And last, but certainly not least, we have our final Parmesan mustard sighting. In the episode of Season 5, Rom Trom, we see Job preparing it. Notably, he just tastes it a little and then just goes and drinks instead. So I don't. Yeah. Also, it's 2015 now. No, it has not been 3 years. This takes place right after Season 4. Don't ask me how that works. I don't know what that means. Now, some of you are probably thinking, wow, you presented us with this awesome, incredible, hilarious written analysis. Like, seriously, I think you should become a comedian or something because it got me slapping my absolute knees. Like, really, you've got something special, kid. Never give up on new dreams. But is there really a precedent for this? It feels kind of out of the blue. Well, there is a precedent, and I'm not talking about the Bluth Company. Unless, like, you mean company as in, like, the family. You're like, you know, as if you were saying, like, oh, we have company.
Dear Diary.
I'm sitting here and talking about stuff. There isn't one story for how eating disorders develop. They can come about for varying reasons. But to simplify it, it can be boiled down to genetics and environment. And to start with genetics, all the studies I found on this were on like AFAB people, so wasn't really helpful in this case. But just to talk about it because it's interesting, more than 50% of what can contribute to the development of eating disorders has to do with genetics that control appetite, depression, fullness, and anxiety. If these things aren't managed properly, they can create a greater susceptibility to eating habits that, whether they started out disordered or not, can lead to disordered eating. And if you have a family member who had an eating disorder, that also increases your chances of developing one, especially if it's someone in your immediate family, in which the chances increase by 10. Again, I'd like to say that unless I missed something, all these studies were on AFAB people, and so I couldn't tell you if it's different for AMAB people. I don't know, obviously. And but it felt notable to mention, not conclusive of anything, but notable nonetheless. Now, onto things I can more concretely address: his environment. First of all, just existing on Earth with these societal expectations of what the ideal body for men is not doing him any service. It's pretty much impossible to avoid fat phobia, even if like topics of food and weight and appearance overall are dealt with properly at home. If you remember from earlier, I mentioned a couple studies that talk about the normalization of unattainable body types through only representing them in media, and how that leads to self-esteem issues and having negative feelings about one's own completely healthy normal body. It's in ads, it's in TV shows, it's in shows and movies and books. You hear from your peers, doctors, in your school, work, etc., etc., etc. Diet culture is incredibly pervasive. In the season 1 episode Let Him Eat Cake, the Bluth family jumps on the diet bandwagon of 2003 and 2004, going on the Atkins diet for no other reason other than it being the new right way to eat. To summarize, it's a diet that like highlights proteins and fats and cutting carbs, and just like every other like fad diet, it may initially like help some lose weight, but it does not, you can't sustain it. And it doesn't live up to the promise of being a high-calorie way to stay thin forever, as the title of Robert Atkins' book claimed. So, with cultural pressures alone, that's hard enough, but Job is also having these kinds of things perpetuated at home. If you've watched the show, the idea that there was a fat-phobic, diet-focused mindset in the Bluth home wouldn't be surprising. But the idea that Job, as well as his brothers, were subject to it may not have registered. Or maybe it did register. Maybe you did notice. I didn't notice until recently. Maybe you did notice. A+ on noticing, if you noticed. But if you're like me and didn't notice, that can be attributed to what typically leads eating disorders in cis men to be undiagnosed. And definitely not that it's a personal interpretation. It's 150 million% canon. This is what Mitch Hurwitz intended. People aren't usually on the lookout for eating disorders in guys because, they don't expect it. And especially with the way that particularly health-focused eating disorders can present themselves, it might not even register as, disordered behavior in the first place. Excessive exercise after a binge, that's not purging. You gotta burn off those calories. Fasting and lowering caloric intake isn't restriction, it's called cutting weight. Ever heard of it? And obsessive, focus on a pure and clean diet isn't unhealthy. It's literally the exact opposite. Sorry, I sound kind of condescending. I don't blame people for not knowing this. This is like at least a bajillion things that I don't know. The problem is that we're not taught about this. And, people just have the idea that either men don't get eating disorders or that there's a specific way that eating disorders can look, and it just, flies under the radar. Just as feminine people have expectations for how they're supposed to look and act, so do masculine people. These expectations are ubiquitous in the Bluth family household. George and Lucille, but mainly George, holds all of his sons up to this expectation of what he deems man enough. Because, he's a really cool, awesome womanizer, and also a rich businessman with a wife and kids. Yes, those things do contradict each other. But yeah, his sons all have deficits in those areas to varying degrees, and those are the most common areas of criticism for them. But they're not the only criticism they get in terms of being the expectations of being man enough. It also extends to their bodies. A prime example of this is in the season 5 episode Saving for Raiment Day, during the documentary flashback segment at the start of the episode. It's a swimsuit portion of the newly dubbed Junior Mr. and Mrs. Bluth competition, and the children are all parading around in a circle in their outfits. Immediately, George comments that he's
very disappointed with these swimsuits.
And asks,
"What's with the shirts?"
Now, at first I was like, I don't know, George, why do you care? You can still see the swim trunks. But then I was like, you know what? That's a good question. What is
with the shirts?
Why are they all wearing shirts in the swimsuit portion of the competition? And, to add on to that, why does Buster go swimming in the ocean with his shirt on? And to circle back, why does George care so much? Almost like it's not about judging swimsuits, but judging their bodies. As if that wasn't already obvious when earlier in the week, Lucille said,
"Sure you'll all be thin by Thursday, Lindsay."
So.
Better bring it.
But yeah, they're trying to cover up so they won't be judged. This is further proven when Lucille says to Michael,
"A little more Magnum PI, a little less Higgins."
Which to translate basically just means be more manly. And Job has done push-ups for multiple years to as a display of his physical strength, and also wears Stan Sitwell's eyebrow as a mustache to sort of try and get points for masculinity. So, you know, their parents have put out a clear message that there's something that the boys are supposed to be striving for. Just like Lindsay, the boys are also subject to dieting and bodily scrutiny. We don't see this specifically happen to Michael and Job, as far as I remember. We do see Lucille policing Buster's weight and diet on multiple occasions. In the season 1 episode Shock and Awe, we see that feeding Buster meals that consist solely of cottage cheese is a recurring thing that Lucille does. We see this first in the flashback to when Lucille adopts Anyang, spurred by Buster refusing to eat his cottage cheese. And then the second time we see it is later in the episode when she's left nothing but a tub of cottage cheese for Buster to have for dinner. Now, similar to the mustard stuff I mentioned earlier, cottage cheese is a very common diet food and would have been especially prevalent during the times that Lucille was growing up and raising her kids. And if this isn't convincing enough evidence that this is a deliberate tactic to get Buster to lose weight, in the deleted scene in the season 3 episode Sobs, we see unambiguous evidence of this. Lindsay, who's been taking a more active role as a housewife and a mother, unfortunately not to her own daughter, but you know, she's really trying her best. You know, she offers her brother, Buster Bluth, some of her hot ham water, to which he says,
"This is so much better than Mother's stingy broth water. She only uses half a bouillon cube per cup now. She thinks I'm fat."
I don't know if I'm saying bouillon right, but I procrastinated looking it up, and I'm gonna continue to do that. Anyway, so bouillon cubes are like 20 calories at most. That is nothing. And yet Lucille is cutting the servings in half for the explicit reason of trying to get Buster to lose weight. We also learn in the same scene that Buster weighs himself consistently enough to know that he's kept off the 6 pounds since he lost his hand. If not even Buster is spared from Lucille's vitriolic body shaming, you know, he's her baby, her precious baby. If even he isn't exempt from it, I have a hard time believing the others would either. And whether they were or not, Job just even existing in the environment where these things are happening to Buster and Lindsay, he would have ended up absorbing those ideas. But if this was all festering underneath the surface, why did he only develop an eating disorder now, just as he's nearing 40? Well, let's think back to that timeline. He's got a lot going on. His life is like stress city right now. Eating disorders are mental disorders, not food disorders. They're most often formed as a way to feel in control. Maybe you can't control the garbage going on in your life, but maybe you can control your weight. Maybe you can control your diet. And Job's life is really just fallen out of his hands at this point. Not that he was ever particularly adept at juggling all those balls in the air, but this was just a real swift rug pull from underneath him. You know, his relationship with Anne, his sexuality crisis, his persisting mental health issues that for 5JK, it's 8 now because of the 2015 thing, he's been managing via roofing himself every night, regardless of whether it was like, you know, because usually he would have a forget me now when things were like, oh, I don't want to remember. He just does it regardless now. So regardless of that, because he can't but bear to remember another day, and he's like addicted to them and stuff. So safe to say he's dealing with a lot. His life feels out of his hands. He can't control his sexuality. He can't control his love life. He can't control his dependence on forget-me-nows. But maybe there is something that he can control. At the same time, what separates this from any other stressful point in his life, which is to say, like, all of the points, his whole life, the entire thing. Because, you know, these problems aren't new. Sure, they've been pushed to a real extreme by season 4, but, you know, it doesn't make the past 38 years of his life any less filled with abuse and trauma. But, you know, there's a very significant difference. This time his life starts unraveling. First of all, he doesn't have Michael. Michael is the force that kept everyone together, and the only one willing to support Job. Except, like, Buster, but he's, like, a nerd, so, you know, Job relied on Michael to, you know, pick up after his mistakes, support his dreams, be able to give hugs without being deemed too much, not be judged as harshly as he would by the rest of his family. On top of that, he doesn't even have the constant of the rest of his family to rely on. Now, it's not like the rest of his family's opinions on him are particularly good, except Buster, but again, nerd. But there's still comfort in that familiarity, and sorry, if he really needed someone to support him, I guess he could go to Buster, even though he's like a total nerd. Gag me. But Job doesn't even have a little dweeby baby brother to go to for support. He's all alone. And throughout all of season 4, we see him trying to fill this void. First, there was Anne's family, who he unfortunately could not really benefit from, given like the context of the situation. He really did not want to be there. And even though, you know, he had no intention of marrying Anne, he was still disappointed when he saw that none of his family had shown up to the wedding. Even worse, he actually gets excited when, oh my god, who's that? It's Tobias. Oh my god, Tobias, you've come to the wedding. This is so awesome. Only to find out that, you know, he is there for the wedding, but not because he invited him. He has absolutely no idea that Job's getting married. He's playing Roman Centurion number 2 in the illusion that Job is performing at the wedding that he's using to escape with. Job expresses his disappointment to Anne when she asks him what's wrong. You know, she knows what the Blues are like. She knows the toxicity of that environment, so she like reassures him like, you know what? Your magic trick is gonna go great. And as for your family, you have a new family now. It's, you know, it's really hard to have a family that doesn't care about you, but Anne and her whole family can help him work through it all. And Job just mumbles to himself, I don't want
these.
Just further rubbing the family's disdain and lack of care for him. Job, you know, he almost dies from being locked in the boulder and the storage locker, you know, that whole thing. And no one goes to visit him in the hospital except Anne, who's like, I'm leaving you. You're gonna be alone forever. Which, like, let's just give her a round of a hand here. You know, you tell him, and you tell him you can do like 1,000 ways better than him. He doesn't deserve you. Anyway. He reads a pamphlet wrong and ends up calling his son Steve, you know, and asks him to meet up, and they have, you know, a bit of an emotional moment, and Job ends up deciding it's like, yeah, let's work together. We're gonna make Steve Holt pest control into Steve Holt and Dad pest control. We're gonna be a family. But once again, his emotional vulnerability issues and, you know, desire for approval in terms of having more superficial womanizer attributes trumps that, and he ends up ditching Steve for the entourage. He had two opportunities where a truly loving family member, you know, welcomed him with open arms, and, you know, and in spite of any transgressions, they were, you know, willing to give him a chance. But now, in the entourage, he's just back in the same environment where he's being tossed aside and made fun of for his neurodivergent traits, and having those neurodivergent traits being taken advantage of so he can get the short end of the stick without realizing it. He's desperately clinging to them. He needs them. He needs a family, because without a family, there's not going to be anyone to catch him. But, you know, eventually he loses them too and grieves the loss despite those 8 years being absolute hell for him and his friends, his family, you know, not actually liking or caring about him at all. Job also almost dies during that period of time, and no one comes to visit him. Finally, at the end of the season, he's like given the opportunity to get back into the family, and he like immediately jumps on that, especially since he's been promised the position of president. You know, he's floundering with that his family. All the Blues are. You know, he's struggling to find his place in the world and attempting and failing to feign normality so as to not isolate himself and be deemed as the other. And as his search for people who feel like home stretches on and the sweater that is his life continues to unravel, he finds other ways to hold up the threads. Anyway, in conclusion, this is the only correct interpretation. It's canon. It's real. Mature. He's actually here right now. He's behind the camera, but he's just kind of camera shy. You know, classic Mitch. But no, obviously, this is just my interpretation informed by my life experiences. I just thought it would be, like, interesting to explore since men with eating disorders are so rarely portrayed in media, especially when they manifest atypically. And I just thought this would just be a good way to sort of, like, you know, discuss that and bring awareness to it. So, yeah, that's right. I tricked you into learning. Consider yourself informed.
in this Jesus character, I mean, he was.
Better bring it.